There's 1,000 ways to get to your retirement plan and your retirement end goal. There's generally only 3 or 4, though, that are going to work for you. Welcome to the Balanced Blueprints podcast, where we discuss the optimal techniques for finances and health, and then break it down to create an individualized and balanced plan. I'm your host, Justin Gaines, here with my co-host, John Proper. In this episode, we discuss how to identify your goals for retirement, how inflation can eat away at those goals, and whether or not you should pay down your debts or invest the difference. Thank you for listening to this episode, and we hope you enjoy it. Ironically, it kind of ties into a lot of the conversations I've been having with my clients lately about not looking at what the long-term impacts are of their financial plans. Mm-hmm. A lot of clients that I've been working with, especially over the last week, and because we're in the tail end of the year, which I know this podcast is going to get posted not at the tail end of the year, most likely it'll be in the beginning of a year, so it'll sound a little bit nuanced here. But given that we're at the end of the year, a lot of people are starting to think about taxes and starting to quote unquote tax plan. I would say they're more tax reacting because they're thinking about their taxes in December, and they should have been thinking about their taxes January through December. So, they're tax reacting instead of tax planning and tax strategizing throughout the year. But when we start talking about their financial retirement plans and what they're doing for retirement, almost always the conversations that they've had and that they're experienced with, if they've talked to a financial advisor or if they're just interested in finances, is the accumulation period. So putting away for retirement. But when I flip the conversation and say, okay, that's all fine and dandy, that makes sense, we can talk about that. But I need to know what your financial, your retirement utopia looks like. What does retirement look like for you? Because I really don't know what that number is that I need for you at retirement if I don't know what your plans are in retirement. Somebody who plans on buying a house in their hometown when they're in their 30s or 20s, paying it off over 30 years, and then retiring in their hometown and maybe taking one vacation every year like they did during their working years, but otherwise small little trips, their financial needs in retirement are going to be significantly different than the person who says, I busted my butt all my working years and now I want to go and travel during my retirement years. And if they're in good health and they're taking care of themselves and they can do that, absolutely, more power to you. Right. But your financial needs are going to be very different. The other thing that needs to be taken into consideration is your taxes. A lot of people, because they're only looking at the accumulation, they're looking to be able to put away as much as possible now and lower their tax burden today, instead of looking at what their taxes are going to be in retirement.
So then what I think I was hearing earlier, and redirect me if I'm wrong, but we kind of got into this is because what we want to do is look long-term. Like, we need to know someone's long-term goal in order to give them the best advice now. And that's the same for financial and health. Like, you can't tell someone how to invest now, what to do now, if you don't know what their retirement looks like. So what's been going on there with clients?
Right. So I will say is we'll do another topic on, if you do have a large tax return, what do you do with that money? Because there are certain things that I would recommend there, but I don't want to derail us there. So we'll definitely do some mini posts and topics on that as well. But as far as your specific question of looking at what do you need in retirement, a lot of times we want to look at, there's certain things that are consistent no matter what you're going to end up with in retirement or what your plans are in retirement. But the key components that we want to look at is geographically, where do you want to be for retirement, so that we can look at what are the costs of living in that area. You may want to move. You may want to go down south. You may want to move up north. Who knows what geographic area you want to be in, whether it's staying put or moving, that plays into the calculation. The other thing is, when do you want to retire? Are you trying to retire at 50, 55, 60, 65, 70? Do you plan on, like somebody like myself, I don't ever actually plan on fully retiring. So I'll have income in retirement because I'll continue to do consulting work, and I'll probably continue to run the insurance agency and the investment properties along with the other businesses that I have. And so as a result of that needs to be taken into consideration, because our income's not going to zero and we're relying on investments. We need to take all of these elements into consideration, determine what we ideally want in retirement, put a value on that in today's dollars, And then we're going to look at, okay, so if this would cost us $50,000 a year to live in today's dollars, what would that look like after 20 years of inflation, 10 years of inflation, 30 years of inflation? What does that look like? Because like when I'm doing financial planning for my life insurance clients, while most entry-level plans, we do put in a very small amount of whole life into that plan, and then the rest is term until we get into tax strategies, tax planning, and the other stuff. But to cover basic needs, we're generally talking about term insurance and a very small portion of whole life. Now, some people are going to hate that, but the reason that we do that is I don't want to take out of your investments and your financial planning and say, we need to carve out this small nest egg of this in order to cover funeral expenses, issuance of will, and burial cost. We don't want to have to do that. So the small whole life policy does that. But if you take somebody who's our age, mid-20s, and you say they're going to live until 80, which life expectancy honestly is pushing beyond that. And so generally speaking, we probably will live longer than 80. But if you go to 80, you're looking at over 50 years of inflation. And so if you take the average funeral cost between $10,000 and $15,000, if you take the low end at 10 grand and you apply a 3% inflationary rate to that over 50 years, you end up at a number that's over 50 grand for funeral expenses, retirement, issuance of will. And that's on the low end. That's on the low end of a funeral cost, applying a 3% interest rate when we're in a market where we're at 5.5. The reason why we use 3 is because that's the average interest rate, generally speaking, historically. So that's why I use the 3% number. And
yeah, that's good.
We use $50,000 as that whole life piece because I don't mind dipping in a small amount, $10,000, which may not sound like a large amount, but generally speaking, if 10,000 becomes 50, $10,000 in 50 years is not a large sum of money. Yeah. And so I don't mind dipping in for $10,000 because it would be chump change at that point effectively. But we want something there to be able to cover that burden.
Right.
Same though applies for your income. So if 10,000 turns into 50,000, and I haven't actually run these numbers, so the 10 to 50, for example, I know that number is accurate, but I'm going to jump and extrapolate now. If you take and say we need $50,000 of income, we need $250,000 of income to be at the same income level adjusted for inflation in retirement. Now you take that person who says, I can retire with $1 million, our age. I can retire if I have $1 million. You'll have 4 years of income. 4 and like a quarter when you take into account growth on that asset over time. But you're going to have like 4.25 years of retirement income. So if your life expectancy is, we'll say 85, you're retiring at 81 in order to have enough money. And so if we're just looking at accumulation, we start pulling out numbers out of thin air that make sense to us in today's dollars. But if we're not achieving higher than inflationary rates of return, we're not going to be able to get where we need to be in retirement. Right. So in order to calculate how much we need to save each year today, we need to look at how much are we going to need to spend in distribution. The analogy I like to use with my clients is it's a lot like taking a hike. If you plan out a hike, and since we're in New York and we have the Adirondacks, we'll talk a high peak. If you're trying to do a high peak in the Adirondacks, you don't just wake up one day and say, I'm going up to the Adirondacks to hike Mount Marcy. It's not happening. You plan that out. You know that you're doing that in the shortest period of time, maybe 3 days in advance. Even avid hikers that I know probably would not do it with less than 3 days of planning. You're looking at weather, which I would say is inflation. You're looking at what are your equipment needs that you need. So what type of protective gear, insurance, what type of investments, tools, lights, first aid kits, all of that sort of stuff. What type of stuff do I need to bring with me in order to be there safe? What type, how much water do I need? How much food and snacks do I need? And if you only planned your hike for what would I need on the trip up, when you get to the descent, you're not going to have any water left, you're not going to have any food left, and you're not going to have all of these elements left to get you down. Now, going down is always easier than going up, and the same is true with retirement. Distributing is always easier than going up and accumulating if you had the right gear. If you don't have the right gear, You're trying to go up, you're dehydrated. You might roll your ankle. And even if you plan everything out perfectly, you might roll your ankle, you might end up dehydrated. You might end up, there might be an animal that gets in your way.
Right.
There's the skunk, a porcupine, whatever the case may be. You could have something that derails you and throws you off the path. There could be trees that are in the way, whatever the case may be. It's one of the things that maybe not when you're hiking, but in the financial world, it's the one thing that we can guarantee is that you're going to have hurdles. Somebody's going to get sick. Somebody's going to get hurt. You're going to have an unexpected child, or maybe you have an expected child and the child ends up being sick, or any one of these elements. There are things that are going to be there to derail you. Now, where the analogy falls apart is when, hopefully, if you're hiking Mount Marcy and you don't have the right stuff, you realize that partway up the hike and you start turning around and going back down. Unfortunately, our lives do not work like that. Our timeline doesn't stop, and we can't just turn around and say, okay, we're just going to retire now and go this way. Ultimately, what ends up happening is you have to go and take the higher, steeper portion of the mountain and make it happen. You have to start taking more losses here and give up certain experiences and travel and luxuries that you might be experiencing in order to save for the accumulation. But if you're not thinking about distribution when you're having your retirement conversations and your financial planning conversations, you're mismanaging your money and you're essentially throwing mud at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the thing that stuck with me the most is plans never go as expected, and there's going to be a ton of hurdles. So with that, like, especially from someone that, like, in the health world, it's, very similar. It's not linear. You don't just heal like this. If we're talking mental health, physical health, it's up, down, up, down, up, down. But for that space, I know the answers and I know what to help, clients with, like, okay, well, if you hit a bump in the road, this is what we do. But like, if I hit a bump in the road of financials, how am I getting past that bump if I have to turn around? Is it because I have different investments? Is it, what's helping me get through that?
So typically this is where a lot of times when we have bumps in the road, the biggest bumps that I find with clients, or even the biggest starting points, because whenever I'm working with a client, I'm never starting I shouldn't say never. There are some clients where I start at the base of the mountain. I start with them and then I'm doing financial plan for their kids. I'm not at the base of their mountain, but I am at the base of their kids' mountain because, I mean, I have financial plans for some individuals that are literally babies. They're 6 months old and we're starting to put together their plan.
Why not?
That's the base of the mountain. Like, that is the sweet spot. And that kid is going to be able to absorb a lot more hurdles because he's the fittest guy on the trail or girl on the trail, fittest person on the trail, and has all of the equipment that they could possibly need. They have all of the best and nicest equipment. And so they can handle most things.
Practicing since day one.
And they have the energy and the ability to actually carry all of that equipment through to retirement. And so they can adjust and pivot and do all of these things. So a lot of times what ends up happening is either when I start working with you or throughout the course of working with you, we get a curveball and debt gets taken on. And so it's either credit card debt, it's a personal loan, it's refinancing the house, it's a whole slew of things. And the question then becomes, how quickly can we get back on track? And a lot of times it might not be paying off the debt. Paying off the debt isn't always the right answer. The number one thing with debts that you need to look at is, what is my interest rate and what is the rate of return that I can get on my investments? If I know that I can, in an average year, get 8% rate of return or 7% rate of return on my money, I should be investing any extra money that I would be putting towards debts that have a lower interest rate than that, because you're essentially money ahead. If I have a car loan that I'm paying 6% on, but I know that if I put my money into, for me personally, if I know that I put my money into my Roth IRA, I know that eventually my income is going to cap me out on my Roth contributions. So I want to max out my Roth contributions as early as possible. And I also want to maximize my returns. 6% car loan, which is an expense at 6%, but I know on average that's going to net me 8.5%, 9% rate of return in the stock market. And that's not taking into account dividends and reinvesting that and rolling that. That's just a fixed number. Because that 8.5 or even 8% is higher than the 6, I'm making an additional 2% on my money. So I better put that into the Roth and continue to pay the minimum payment on my car loan instead of knocking the car loan out. Now, where that inverts is my car loan's 9% and I'm getting 9% on the Roth. Now it's equal. Personally, invest in the investment. Don't pay it off when it's equal. Because when it's equal, you're only eliminating a 9% expense for if you have a really long car payment for 7 years, potentially shorter than that, versus getting 9% until retirement. So until, we'll say 65. So for another 40 years, we're getting 9% versus eliminating it for 7 years.
And I imagine that 9% will, so if you're paying into your investment, it will give you more money because it's 9% on a higher number every time versus the car.
Correct. It's compounding.
Yeah.
It's compounding. And with your minimum payment, you have a plan where you're going to end it. So you're going to get a rate of return. You're going to get that 9% longer by investing it. But the minute it goes to 9.5%, 10%, pay off the debts.
Right.
Pay off the debts. Once the interest rate is lower than the average rate of return of whatever your investment class is, eliminate the debt.
Right.
Now, that's on paper. And this is where you and I have had a ton of conversations about that. That is on paper. That is financially, that is the most sound and secure advice that you can get as far as eliminating those debts. And don't follow, we'll pay off the lowest balance. Interest rate, rate of returns, those are the things that matter. Those are the things you need to look at. Don't look at the balance amount. Don't look at those things. Interest rate, highest interest rate gets paid off first, then lower interest rates. And that's if you're just using very simple principles. There are unique and creative ways that we can do this as well, but sticking with the basics here, that's what you want to look at. But there's also the largest and most important aspect of investing and any part of your financial picture is your attitude towards it. So if you have your attitude and your emotions towards it, if you aren't going to be able to emotionally handle having the debt and it's going to deter you from your financial plan, eliminate the debt. I don't care if it's a 3% debt and you're getting 8% in the market. If you know that the amount of stress and wherewithal on your mental progress towards your investments is going to be negatively impacted by having that debt looming over top of you, you need to clear that out. And working with a financial advisor, you'll be able to determine what your risk tolerance is, what makes the most sense for you, and develop a strategy. Ultimately, that financial advisor or myself, if you're working with me, will be able to tell you this is going to negatively impact you. If we will clear this out, you need to toughen up a little bit on this and not worry about it because we're making the right logical decision. Or they're going to tell you, totally understand, your risk tolerance doesn't allow for this. Let's knock out this debt. It's not going to negatively impact you. We just need to know that this $400 a month payment, once you have this debt cleared out, needs to go, 100% of that needs to go into your retirement and investment accounts in order to catch you back up for the lost time that you had by clearing out the debt when you really should have been fully funding your retirement over here.
Right.
And the key element there is having a plan, having a strategy to attack, and making sure that it's not going to derail us too much or at all from our distribution plan.
Hey, I'm in holistic health, and that sounds like holistic finances. You need someone, like you said, that understands your goals, your risk tolerance, what you want. Because, again, you and I, and you just described it perfectly, the numbers don't lie. Based on the numbers, that's the best thing to do. And I can tell someone if they want to heal, if they want to get healthy, like, this is the best exact thing you can do. But as we talked about in our last one, like, is it ideal for some people to need, let's say, 4 cheat meals a week or 4 cheat days a week? It's like, no, I don't want my clients to do that. But does that mean they get then 3 days of good eating? It's like, okay, not the best, but what if they don't have that? Then they have 7 days of bad eating, so it's all about kind of that net positive. And I think we can always, in the health world, I think we can work on this. You can weigh in if you think someone's risk tolerance can change, but I think you can take baby steps to maybe get to a more ideal spot if someone's
100%. 100%. It's actually, that was the next point that I was going to say, is that same person who has 4 cheat meals and 3 regular meals, ultimately that person who has, especially, I mean, with mortgage rates the way they were and people acquiring properties, I have this conversation a lot of times where they have a 3% mortgage and they're like, I want to knock this out. Like, it's really low and I can see the principal go down. And that's what's motivating them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
If I feel that their risk tolerance will allow for them to put a portion towards retirement, but continue to pay down a portion of the investment, I'll get them to do that, because it's the same thing. If you have, we'll say $700 extra that you're paying towards the mortgage. Now you can do this with $70, but for analogy purposes, you see $700 that you're paying towards that. If I can take and have you put $300 into an investment account and pay $400 extra, we're only talking about the extra payments here, $400 extra towards the mortgage. As you see the $300 compound in the investment account, you're going to be like, wow, okay, I see this. This is good. I like this. Let me allocate $400 here and $300 over here. And the same thing applies in the health world. You start feeling better. You start with 1 or 2 workout days, and you're like, wow, okay, I'm getting bigger.
As soon as you get a taste,
once you get that, then you start to get addicted. And I use the analogy all the time. It's building the muscles. It's building the interest and the desire and the muscles and the strength to be able to see how this plays out, how this is going to move, how are we going to make this plan work.
And this will be in,
And once they develop those, then they start to understand it more. And so your risk tolerance may start to ease up, because you start to see, oh, this isn't actually as risky as I thought it was, because you see the end goal. And ultimately, somebody's risk tolerance will change over time. That is guaranteed. Even if you're ultra conservative in your 20s, at retirement, you're going to be ultra conservative.
Yeah.
Because you really can't
more
lose
factors. Yeah.
And so it's one of those things that we want to, as a general rule of thumb, there are certain risk tolerance for each age bracket. But if you're outside of a normal deviation from that, we're going to want to pull you and educate you and develop you into an appropriate risk tolerance for your age group in order to maximize your rates of return and effectively have your accumulation accumulate quicker, or have your distribution be able to be focused into distribution and not losses of capital.
Right. And I think an important thing that we're both really hitting on here is you're building that trust, and whether it's you're first building it with the person you're working with, but ideally you're building it with the client themselves. Like, the client is gaining trust back in themselves. Of, if I want to use food, for example, like, I won't use the cheat days because I guess it's a little more extreme example. Say I tell someone, like we talked about, eat this amount of protein at each meal per day. Like, that's it. Don't change anything else. Then they're going to start building trust in you, because they're going to see results. They're going to say, okay, maybe he knows what he's talking about. But then I want to turn it around and be like, no, build trust in yourself, because like, you did that. Trust yourself. Like, I can take these baby steps and get to a better spot. Like, okay, now what else can I do? It's just empowering our clients with the information.
Right.
So that's
it's diversifying. It's diversifying your assets, and you want to diversify to a certain extent. Diversification can be really good or really bad for your rate of returns. So there's definitely a balance there to have. But just like you want to diversify the types of food you're eating, you don't want to eat just one type of food. You want to have a mix of financial products in your portfolios in order to be able to weather those storms, in order to be able to adjust and pivot and move. Mm-hmm. And that's why when we build a financial plan for somebody, we discuss your investments, your insurance, whether it's your homeowners and auto or your business insurance, but we also discuss your life insurance and how is that playing into it. There are a lot of times most clients, whether they want to admit it or not, should consider, at the very least, developing some sort of cash value life insurance in order to help them in their distribution. A lot of people put a lot of hate on whole life insurance policies because I could pay less for term and invest the difference. And that's all fine and dandy. And it's true. You would technically get a higher rate of return on that. But what they're not doing is they're not leveraging what we call the power of zero. So if you used an indexing strategy, or even you use a whole life or an indexed universal life that has an indexing strategy, both of those have certain guarantees in them. You do not have guarantees in the stock market. And so you're guaranteed on a whole life policy a minimum interest rate. On an indexed universal life, you're guaranteed a floor that the interest rate will never go below a certain dollar amount, whether that's 0%, 1.5%, varies by contract. So you have to look at the specifics. But the benefit to that is if you would hope this never happens, but somebody in our age bracket where you're more aggressive in your investments, this could happen. And people did see it happen during COVID, during the housing crisis back in the early 2000s, where your investment takes a massive dip, 20, 30, 40% loss on it. If you had a 20, 30% loss year, what do you have to have the next year in order to get back to break even?
Maybe 40 to 60.
So most people will say 30%. If I have 30%, I'll be
right. Just a bit.
It'll offset. So if you take $100,000 in investments, and you take a 50% loss, what are you at?
50,000.
Okay. Now, if you have a 50% gain on that, what are you at?
50 of your 50.
So correct, 50. So
75.
You're at 75. So you had two equal rates, equally contrasting rates of return, 50% down, 50% up.
Yeah.
To get back to break even, you have to have double the rate of return. You have to have 100% rate of return on your money in order to get back to zero.
So to then be where you want to be, you'd need like a 200% or 150.
Right. And like I said, these are big numbers because we're trying to emphasize without being able to have to calculate it on paper. But the same is true. If you go down 3%, you need 6% to get back to zero.
Yeah.
So what an indexing strategy does, and having some value, some whole life insurance of some component, allows you so that during your distribution phase, if there's a down market, you can take your normal annual distributions out of your whole life policy, tax-free because you take it as a loan, so you have tax benefits to it. So it will operate similar distribution-wise to a Roth IRA. Because you already pay taxes on it, you're not paying taxes on distribution, you're going to take it as a loan. But when you have a down year, the reason why the stock market's so beautiful is that it consistently, over a long period of time, goes up. If you look at the stock market over any extended period of time, it has increased. Mm-hmm. The problem is if you look at individual isolated periods of time, it may have gone down.
Right.
So what does that mean? We need to, in a down year, we need to stay in the market for a longer period of time. So we need to not be taking distributions. Well, if we're in retirement, we need income. You have to take distributions. We can't just say, well, we're just not going to live this year. We're going to have $0. So if you don't have these indexing strategies, these whole life policies built into the retirement plan, you have to compound your loss. You not only have to take the 3% decrease in the stock market value, you also have to take, general rule of thumb, 4% of your capital or your principal is what you're taking out. So now you're at a 7% decline versus if you had a 3% loss and we took the equivalent amount of normal income distributions out of your whole life insurance policy, you have the ability to live, but we just bought you time in the market for it to return back to or above where it was at. And so your whole life insurance policy ends up buying you back your rate of return in your investment portfolio if you have it built into your strategy. Right. But way too many people are looking at accumulation phase, not distribution. And so they are saying, I could put more money in my investments if I didn't have this whole life policy. And the whole life policy isn't going to grow as quickly as my Roth IRA or my IRA or my 401k. And while that may be accurate, and it generally is accurate, what you're not doing is you're not buying the time in distribution to allow your investments to recover in down years.
You're not seeing the whole picture.
Right. It's insurance. Whole life insurance not only insures your life, it ensures your distribution of income in retirement if structured properly.
But they're not all like that, and people get,
well, there's a lot of people who sell those policies who don't structure them properly. And those are the financial vampires that'll say, they're going to watch my video and they're going to send it to somebody and they're going to say, this is what we're going to do with your plan. Yeah. But they don't know how to structure it. And
right. So, well, and that's why it's going to be, I think we're going to have to dive into it a lot more because not everyone can be working with you or even someone else with the same knowledge. So, they're going to have to be their own advocates. So when someone like we'll just use the term they use, a financial vampire selling them stuff, we should go over like, hey, if this looks like this, like take a step back, ask them these questions, because we want to make sure people can protect themselves from getting into a bad one like that.
Right. No, absolutely. For sure. You have to find somebody you can trust and who is super knowledgeable. And we can definitely break down the questions and the things to look for. Because ultimately, what I want to do is I want to have the person so that when they're out at the bar, at a party with their friends, and they're talking about what they're doing with me, they're excited about it. And when their friend says, oh, I don't know, I was told this, they're able to then respond back with, and that might work for you. But for my position, this is why we're doing this, and this is what makes sense. And, maybe you should talk to him as well and see if what you've been taught makes sense or doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And there's times that I tell clients, I probably tell in any given week, I probably am telling, if I'm meeting with 10 clients in a week, I'm probably telling 4 of them, you shouldn't change what you're doing or change your advisor. You should stay right where you are. I would ask these questions. I would make these adjustments. But honestly, you're in pretty good hands. Like, they would, if I gave you a plan, they would end up coming back and saying the same thing.
Yeah.
You're probably in pretty good hands. I would do this different.
Yeah. Let's leave it at that, man. Health freedom, financial freedom. We want you to know what you're doing and why you're doing it, so you can advocate for yourself, so you can do it without us someday.
Right. Yeah. Ultimately that is the goal.
Thanks for listening to our podcast.
We hope this helps you on your balanced freedom journey.
Please share your thoughts in the comments section below.
Until next time, stay balanced.